Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. We are in the course on the beginning of human life bioethics within the Master of Science in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Always beginning with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Lord, send forth your Spirit, and we shall be recreated. You shall renew the face of the earth. Amen. Okay, before going forward, any questions or comments from previous lectures or anything, the course, the program, life in general? Right, I'm going to lower the lights here for a better view. Okay. I want to finish up a couple of details from in vitro fertilization, and then also a couple of other topics that are still floating around: artificial insemination and ectopic pregnancy. And then in the second part of the lecture, get into natural family planning, which I've mentioned before is really the healthy alternative that is being promoted to counteract either contraception or in vitro fertilization. Okay, so already we've covered quite a bit about in vitro, but basically, I think these topics still were a little loose. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, surrogate motherhood, snowflake babies, and then an aside is artificial insemination. All right. Remember that for in vitro fertilization, there is quality control being done on the human embryo or the fetus, right? In other words, this is a procedure, IVF is a procedure that is totally artificial, done in the lab, and the clinic that goes with the lab. And so there is manipulation and control all along the way, precisely because the couple or the individual, because of course the clinic does not regulate marriage, so it doesn't have to be a couple who is doing the IVF procedure. It can be an individual also. All right. It's not that the clinic will ask for a marriage certificate or anything like that. They just ask for the credit card. And so as long as they have the money to pay for the service, anyone is welcome to the service. It's a market economy. All right. So basically the IVF industry will offer all of these types of quality control so that whoever is paying for the service gets the best baby possible, the highest quality baby possible, all right? And that's why it really falls into a eugenic mentality, because it is selecting on the human individual artificially, not nature doing natural selection in the normal process of fertilization and birth, gestation and birth that happens in nature, okay? That happens naturally. So remember that the genetic testing can be done either before implantation or after implantation. If it's done before implantation, then obviously it's done in the lab when the embryo is still in the lab, before implantation, literally. But then the genetic testing, it can also be done, genetic diagnosis can be done after implantation, in other words, during the pregnancy, okay? And just to talk about that briefly, that type of genetic diagnosis that is done after implantation within the pregnancy itself is not different from the normal genetic diagnosis that is done in a normal pregnancy, because already there is a pregnancy, right? And the pregnancy itself is advancing naturally. That part of the IVF procedure is definitely natural. In other words, the pregnancy. But again, keep in mind chronologically, once we have a pregnancy, then the IVF itself it's done, right? The in vitro fertilization and all the implications of the implantation procedure and all that, that's done and over with. Now we have a pregnancy progressing, supposedly a normal natural pregnancy, right? With the caveat that that embryo is not necessarily the healthiest embryo that could have happened through natural fertilization, because that embryo was essentially manufactured in a lab, and therefore nature was forced there, bypassing the natural selection selective pressure against human sperm of the 100 million to 1 that I talked about. All right, so you follow the argument? Now, so in other words, the normal PD, prenatal diagnosis, normal PD, prenatal diagnosis is done in a pregnancy. Typically, it's amniocentesis, taking some fluid from the amniotic sac and sending that fluid to the lab, because there will be fetal cells that are floating around in the amniotic liquid, all right? And then those fetal cells are analyzed for chromosomal abnormalities and so forth, and whatever passes quality control, the pregnant mother is given the okay. If it doesn't pass quality control, meaning they find some kind of genetic abnormality, they will tell the mother, and then the mother can decide legally to have an abortion, a procured abortion or not. Of course, highly unethical, but legal. I can tell you further that that genetic diagnosis is targeting a number of embryonic abnormalities, and one of them is Down syndrome, to where some countries in Europe have, as a national policy, are targeting specifically human embryos and fetos that carry Down syndrome, and are encouraging the mother highly and putting tremendous pressure for the mother to kill that child, all right? So that is total open eugenics that is being done on the unborn. But you can see the fallacy of that argument, the sad, tragic fallacy and error in that argument is that it's not an argument of logical consistency. Because if these governments want to kill the Down syndrome embryos or fetuses because they are Down syndrome, right? Because they're Down syndrome. Why don't they kill the born Down syndrome children and people, right? It's inconsistent, see? So it boils down to that legalism. Just because they're born, now they're legal, all right? But unborn, they don't have legal status, and therefore they can be killed with impunity. It's a disconnect. It's a dysfunctional argument. It's a schizophrenic argument. Okay, it's an argument of utility at the end of the day. All right, so that's the normal prenatal diagnosis. I'm sorry, prenatal diagnosis, just PD before birth, but in a normal pregnancy. All right, now the extra quality control that the in vitro industry can offer, which has a huge market appeal, especially to the people who can pay for these procedures, right, is the pre-implantation diagnosis. In other words, before the pregnancy, so that the woman doesn't really have to go through a corporeal abortion in case there is some genetic defect with the unborn. You see, she doesn't have to go through the trauma of an actual abortion, because the abortion, with the will, is extracorporeal. The abortion will happen to the morula. In other words, here we have a representation of a morula, right, with all the individual cells, which you remember they're called blastomeres. Here's some photos for remembering, okay? Each one of these cells can be plucked out, and the morula will normally continue with one cell less. The morula can still continue normal development because, again, all of these cells are pluripotent. They all have the same potential to, I'm sorry, they're totipotent, so they have the same developmental potential that the zygote has, all right, up until the blastocyst, which is when we get the cellular differentiation into two different tissues. But before the blastocyst, the zygote and the morula, all of these cells are pluripotent, all right? So bottom line, one of those blastomeres can be plucked out, sent to the lab. Of course, this has to be done very carefully so as not to compromise the integrity of the embryo as a whole. Remember, the embryo is still encased in the cumulus, right, of the zona pellucida and corona radiata to maintain the integrity of the embryo as a whole. And that cumulus is only shed once the embryo is going to implant, all right? So this is done with very delicate, sophisticated equipment and so forth, expensive, right? And so that's the pre-implantation, before implantation. And of course, the appeal of this is that if there is a genetic defect on that embryo, the woman doesn't have to go through the trauma of an actual abortion procedure, either a chemical or a surgical procedure that we talked about earlier, all right? It's the embryo that's simply discarded and killed. Again, either flushed down the toilet or then donated to science to try to put a positive spin on it, right? So that they don't have to tell the woman or the couple, oh no, we flush your defective embryo down the toilet, all right? So too crass, even though it's done. They say, well, no, we'll donate the embryo to a lab, to a scientific lab, and maybe your embryo will be the one that someday cures cancer, right? Because there will be abnormal cell growth in these embryos, and then they become cancerous cell lines for cancer research, et cetera, et cetera. So they put that positive spin on it. And these people will feel good about donating their embryo for scientific research and for medical research, not realizing that the embryo is indeed a human being and that they are in fact giving the death sentence to that embryo. But that is the plain truth, okay, from the biology of it, without any reference to God, religion, or faith at all. Just on the science of it, on the science. Okay, so that's PGID, or sometimes you see it just as PGD, all right? Let me move forward then to the other topic of surrogate motherhood. So I don't think I gave it enough time and justice last time. I did mention that with IVF today, a child can have up to 5 parents, right? And how do we count those 5 parents instead of the normal 2? It could be a mother who, or a woman who donates the egg to the clinic, and a man who donates the sperm, which, by the way, donation is in quotation because they actually get compensated for the effort and for the hassle and for the risk. The woman more, because obviously hyperovulation is much more dangerous, even life-threatening to the woman, in contrast to a crass masturbation, okay? So always, obtaining the eggs will be much more risky and dangerous, again, to women than the counterpart obtaining sperm from men. But anyway, these people, these donors, are compensated for their effort and so forth, and they will be given several $1,000s for those donations. Okay. So there's a woman who donated the egg. There's a man who donated the sperm. Then the third woman could be the woman who is hired to gestate, to carry the pregnancy. All right. But she's not going to keep that baby. She's just her womb is being hired to carry the pregnancy, and then at birth, give the baby to the couple who paid for the whole procedure. So those are the 5, right? And we see one injustice after another, because as that child grows, who are his parents? You know, he's got 3 mothers and he's got 2 fathers. He's got an egg mother, he's got a pregnancy mother, and he's got a wealthy mother who paid for the whole procedure without ever being pregnant from that child. And so one obvious thing that is denied to that child from the paying mother is that there was no bonding, there was no gestational bonding, which is a natural process through those 9 months, which has tremendous impact, not only physiologically. Keep in mind that the cells go back and forth. In other words, fetal cells actually pass the placenta into the woman's body, into the mother's body, and vice versa. Actual cells, not just chemical substances, okay? And so that's even just at the physiological level. So that the immune system of the baby is strengthened by those mother cells that are passed in. And the mother's bonding and biochemical procedure also is enhanced by the fetal cells going into her body. That's just at the physical level. At the psychological level, not to mention that bonding that happens through those months, okay, up until labor. All that is denied automatically to this child. Okay, and then on the father's side, again, the sperm that generated that child is not the sperm of the father who is raising the child, okay, who's also paying for the procedure and so forth. So you see one injustice built into another in the industry, but of course none of that is told to the people. They just want to have this baby and this perfect baby, so the industry provides the service. I'll tell you one case that happened a few years ago, and here is the website that where you can look it up. It actually has a Wikipedia entry. There was a couple, it was a rich couple, a millionaire couple from Australia who couldn't have children, so they went to Thailand. And essentially they hired a poor woman, young woman. Of course, they look for young, healthy women in these developing countries. I think this particular young woman was selling candy in the streets somewhere in Thailand, and to be the gestational mother, all right? And they gave her several hundreds or thousands of dollars, I don't know, but it really made her life, because that's way more than she would have earned selling candy for a whole year or a whole decade or something like that. It would get her off the streets also, and the danger of that kind of lifestyle, everything else. So she was inserted with the traditional 4 embryos, 3 or 4 embryos, and it turns out that 2 actually implanted, okay? 2 implanted. But of course, the Australian couple only wanted their 1 child, all right? And when it was found out that there were 2, they were twins, the pregnancy developed a little bit more. They started doing some genetic testing, and they found out that one of the 2 twins was actually Down syndrome and not the other. So obviously they did not do pre-implantation diagnosis, right? Otherwise they would have detected that earlier on. At any rate, the Australian couple did not want that Down syndrome child and told the Thai woman to undergo selective reduction. In other words, to kill the Down syndrome child and keep the other child. But the Thai woman said no. She was not going to have an abortion. She had agreed to carrying the pregnancy, and there was even a contract of sorts, okay? But not to go through an abortion, okay? It was not in the contract. And so this whole legal morass ensued, to where they wanted to force, the couple wanted to force the Thai woman to have the abortion because they were claiming that's their child, their product, and they paid for it and they didn't want it, so they wanted to discard that product, right? That was defective. And the Thai woman kept saying, no, it's my pregnancy, I'm carrying the pregnancy, and I'm not aborting, all right? So she ended up going through the whole pregnancy of the twins, giving labor, giving the perfect child to the Australian woman, her keeping the Down syndrome child, and then suing the Australian couple for millions of dollars for maintaining this child through life. all right? But it was a horrible mess because at the end of the day, one of the things that actually was illegal was to transport these embryos and across the international boundaries. In other words, across borders, international borders. It turns out that now there are international laws that prevent human embryos from being transported from one country to another in cryopreservation, okay, because it's tantamount to human trafficking. So at least that good came out of cases like this, that now it's illegal at least to transport human embryos from one country to another, because precisely it lends itself to the exploitation of women in developing countries, all right? Renting their womb for a few $100s or even $1,000, these poor women, and they will be exploited that way. Okay, so that was a case that happened a few years ago. You can read the whole article there. And the bottom line about this is that there is a natural right. Keep in mind that before positive rights, which are the law, civil law, all right, there are natural rights. And a positive law, a civil law, is good in where it reflects and respects natural law, which is prior to civil law. And it is natural law is the one that abides for all of us, because nature never forgives. In other words, there are laws in nature that we have to abide by because they apply universally, all right? And there is this natural right then to gestate in the mother who is going to carry us because of the bonding that occurs there naturally, right? Okay, let's move forward now to the third little topic that I had left hanging there, which is the snowflake babies. And there's actually an organization that's called that way, Snowflakes, okay? You can look it up online, snowflake babies. And these are people who are trying to rescue these 2 million frozen human embryos who are in the United States alone, obviously in many other countries of the world. These number of human embryos, cryopreserved embryos, is increasing little by little because the industry is not disappearing by any stretch of the imagination. This industry is actually flourishing. So these cryopreserved babies, also known as spare embryos, right? Spare, imagine referring to a human being as a spare, just like you have spare parts in the closet that you pull out whenever you need them. So these spare embryos, this organization is trying to rescue them. And there was the original article that from the Catholic Church that addressed all these modern manipulation of human life at the beginning of human life is a document that appeared in 1987 called Donum Vitae, the gift of life. So I should have spoken a little bit about these documents earlier, but basically, let me tell you about these documents. So in the Catholic Church, we have documents. They become part of what is known as the magisterium, the official teaching of the church, the magisterium. And the highest level of a church document is an encyclical. An encyclical is written by the Pope directly, of course, with a lot of consultation, and there are drafts that are written for him by several commissions of experts in different fields, including biology, politics, sociology, psychology, theology, biblical studies, etc., because these documents are very profound and of high impact, all right? And they're typically addressed to the whole world, to Catholics and non-Catholics, to all people of goodwill, typically they say, all right? So the highest level of authority in the Catholic Church is known as an encyclical, written by popes, with consultation with many individuals, experts, and commissions, et cetera, et cetera. Then the second level is an apostolic letter, known as an apostolic letter, all right? Also written by the Pope. And then the third level is, so the one general distinction between an encyclical and apostolic letter is an encyclical tends to be a little more theological and dogmatic, whereas an apostolic letter tends to be a little more pastoral and focused on some particular pastoral issue, but tends to be a little less theological or dogmatic, okay? It's almost a technicality. The third level of authority of document authority in the church is known as an instruction. And an instruction doesn't come directly from the Pope, but comes rather from one of the congregations in the Vatican. And now there are several key congregations. These congregations are like departments or offices, right, in the hierarchy of the church at the highest level, which is at the Vatican. All right, so the theological downtown and the ecclesial downtown of the Catholic Church is Vatican, which, by the way, is three entities at the same time. You sometimes you hear about Vatican City, and Vatican City is contained within the Vatican State, right? And the Vatican State is contained within the nation of the Vatican. So all those three entities have the same geographic area, which I think is about 16 square kilometers, right smack in the middle of Rome. Actually, it's on the other side of the Tiber River, so it's not really downtown Rome. At any rate, the Vatican is the official place of the Catholic Church, where there's not only the Pope who lives and works there, but also these different departments that are called congregations. Other type of departments are called dicasteries, but mostly the congregations are the ones that do the work, you know, and there's a congregation for bishops, for example, handles all the administration of all the bishops of the world, who's assigned, who's getting retired, et cetera, who died all of a sudden, who needs to be reprimanded. There's a congregation for clergy, there's a congregation for the laity, and there is this congregation called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Okay, maybe this is a little too small. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Yeah. Right. So, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It's a very ancient congregation. It goes back centuries, actually almost millennium, though it has changed names a little bit. In fact, this used to be the Holy Office of the Inquisition back in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Eventually changed names to the Doctrine of the Faith. In other words, this is the branch, this is the department, the office in the Vatican that is in charge of maintaining the teaching, the Catholic teaching in all of the church documents that come out of the Vatican, all right, including encyclicals and instructions and apostolic letters and all this. So this is kind of the watchdog of the Vatican with regards to the Catholic doctrine is concerned, the Catholic faith. To give an example, the head of this congregation is a very important person, is one of the two hands of the Pope. The one hand, I don't care if it's the right hand or the left hand, but one of the two hands of the Pope is the Secretary of State, right? Which is the one that handles like all the diplomacy of the Vatican throughout the world. That's the Secretary of State, very close to the Vatican. And then the other hand of the Pope is the Secretary of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. All right, so those are the two number twos right after the Pope, okay? And this position is so important, for example, that it was Cardinal Ratzinger who held this position for decades while John Paul II was Pope in the Vatican. Ratzinger was the head of the Congregation of the Faith. When John Paul II died, it turns that Cardinal Ratzinger was actually elected Pope, right, to succeed John Paul II. So typically the people who are the heads of this congregation, they are papabili, okay? They eventually become cardinals, part of the College of Cardinals, the ones who elect the Pope among themselves. And so they are people who are very deeply embedded into Catholic teaching, all right? And they're very erudite people. The one who is heading the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith now under Pope Francis is Cardinal Ladaria, Luis Ladaria, who's a Spanish priest, Jesuit, who was a teacher of mine, was a professor of mine when I was studying my first doctorate in Rome in the 1990s at the Gregorian University, which is the Jesuit university in Rome. I'm not Jesuit, but I've had a lot of Jesuit influence in me and still remain Catholic, as they say. At any rate, Luis Ladaria, when he was a mere priest and a professor at the Gregorian University, he was one of my professors precisely in theological anthropology, okay? Very wise person, very prudent, and he's now Cardinal Ladaria, head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. Anyway, this instruction came out under Ratzinger, when Ratzinger was the prefect. It's called, the official title is prefect of the congregation under John Paul II in the 1980s, 1987. And this was precisely because IVF had become an accepted procedure, medically speaking, clinically speaking. But notice the timing, IVF, so Louise Brown, remember Louise Brown? I mentioned Louise Brown was the first in vitro baby, the first test tube baby, and born in 1979. And so this document was really like 8 or 9 years later, 1987, so about 8 years later. And I remember distinctly because I was just a young priest back then. I was ordained in 85 and always with a mind to study bioethics more deeply. And when this thing came out, I actually used it in my dissertation in Rome in the 90s. But this was a big impact on the world because it's kind of parallel to Humanae Vitae. And that's why it has that title, Donum Vitae. It's like a sequel because Humanae Vitae essentially said no to contraception because it noticed, Humanae Vitae noticed that contraception, artificial contraception, was making a radical separation between the unitive and the procreative by way of having the unitive without the procreative, right? That's contraception. Whereas IVF does the converse. It also separates the unitive from the procreative, but now having the procreative without the unitive, okay? And either way, separating those two dimensions of human sexual intercourse, what happens is it dehumanizes, right? It dehumanizes human sexual intercourse. And so that's why either one is an intrinsic evil, all right? But this is like the flip coin. IVF is the flip coin of artificial contraception. And Donum Vitae is the one that explains in luxury of detail, it's about 40 pages, actually like a booklet, all right? And explains in luxury of detail why artificial in vitro fertilization is, at the end of the day, an intrinsic evil, okay? Because of that radical separation. But here it also mentions artificial insemination, which is different, all right? It's a different procedure, and it's the difference in that procedure that allows it to be ethically okay under certain circumstances. I'm talking about artificial insemination. Okay, so Donum Vitae essentially is no to IVF and maybe to AI, artificial insemination, under the proper conditions. I'll talk about it in a minute, but before I want to finish this discourse, because since Donum Vitae was from 1987, right, 1987, by the time we get to the scenario of snowflake babies, we're already into the 90s, all right? So there was a follow-up document, I think it was in 2008 actually, that is this one that is called Dignitas Personae, the dignity of the human person. It was kind of a follow-up to donum vitae, all right? So let's look at it just briefly. And again, it's from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. And it is a, see, straight up on the title, certain bioethical questions that have come up since donum vitae, all right? In the next 20 years or so since donum vitae, because now we're in the 2000s, a number of questions, further questions have come up because the technologies keep getting more and more sophisticated. And so more and more things can be done in the lab with these human embryos, but the forever question is going to be, should they be done? You know, that's the bioethical questions. They can be done technologically. Yes, now we can freeze them. We can keep them in suspended animation for dozens of years, but should we do that? That's the ethical question, right? And so this document is kind of an updating of donum vitae about 20 years later. And yeah, 20 years after the publication, there it is, of donum vitae. And so here is where they touch on essentially the snowflake babies, in other words, rescuing these embryos. And they stop short, that document stops short of condemning rescuing these embryos, all right? But it's not well seen, but it stops short of saying no outright, as it did with contraception or IVF. In other words, for contraception and for IVF, the church has already spoken officially, and that is no longer what we call a questiones disputate. It's no longer a disputed question, all right, theologically. And so there's a definitive answer there. Both are intrinsic evils, and that's the end of the story. And then we can get into all the theological arguments of why, but there's no more wiggle room. With snowflake babies, in other words, rescuing these human embryos, like I say, that document of Dignitas Personae stops short of saying no, absolutely no. It says, essentially, the document says they don't see how it can happen, but it doesn't close the door. So because it doesn't close the door, then it becomes it stays as one of these disputed questions. And theologians can have opinions either way still. Until the Vatican makes an official declaration, theologians can have an opinion either way, and either opinion is justifiable as long as they provide solid, reasonable arguments, okay? And so my opinion is that it could be done, but certain very stringent provisions have to be in place. And these are the provisions that would need to be in place in order to justify rescuing these human embryos. It will be within the context, first of all, the big picture. It will be within the context of an adoption, all right? That we have adoption of the born as long as certain conditions are in place. In other words, adopting the born should not be just open to anyone whatsoever. For example, single people in principle should not adopt a child because there's no father and mother. It's only a mother, it's only a father. So we're denying the complement to that child as the child is growing up. So single people should not adopt. Because of that, it should be a couple who adopts, and a couple that is heterosexual, a man and a woman, because in today's environment, today's ethos, you have to make that clarification also. I'm talking about a normal heterosexual couple of a man and a woman. Not only that, that couple should also have certain assurances in place so that the adoption is for the benefit, for the full benefit of that baby. I'm talking about a normal adoption, about a born adoption, okay? And by analogy, many of these conditions should apply also to the unborn adoption. Follow? An argument of logical consistency. In other words, keeping in mind, and this is a very informative photo in the sense that these two babies here, and if we go by the color, the traditional color of the two hats or caps that they have, it's a boy and a girl, fine, no problem. but they're definitely born, right? And they're nice and comfy there, sleeping away. This blastocyst over here, assuming it's a human blastocyst, is as human as these two little fellows who are over here already born, all right? Anthropologically, human individual, human being, human person on these two photos, all right? Okay, so with that, then we have to make an argument of logical consistency. What should be in place theologically and ethically to adopt these fellows should be in place also for adopting this fellow over here. All right, so a couple who is married, validly married, all right? Because again, keep in mind that these babies are gonna grow into this family, all right? And this family should be as close as possible to a couple who is having their own child, who fertilized their own child, who gestated their own child, who birthed their own child, and who raised their own child in the normal, natural way that occurs biologically, okay? So the couple should be validly married. They don't have to be Catholic, but they need to be validly married. In other words, married in a proper marriage in the eyes of the Lord, so that their intimacy, even if it's infertile intimacy, is proper in the eyes of God, okay? So the couple should be validly married. Also, so that's as far as the couple itself. Now the procedure, of course, is much easier to adopt these babies who are born already. In the case of an embryo, we're talking about a prospective pregnancy ahead of it, right? Okay. Keeping in mind that once we have a blastocyst like this, even if that blastocyst is in the lab, we're not participating in the in vitro itself, in the fertilization, because the fertilization has already happened, all right? So these embryos are typically cryopreserved. Now, the delicate point is risking the life of this human embryo. How much risk can we endanger? So how much risk can we endanger the life of this human embryo and still be within an ethical framework? That's the challenge, at least in my analysis, okay? And the risk cannot be a risk that is higher than the natural risk, that the risk that occurs in nature. In other words, for example, when we go out in the streets, any day, any particular day, there is a certain level of risk. There's a certain level of risk that we will be injured or killed in the process of a day being outside the home. In fact, even being inside the home, okay, there's a very highly unlikelihood that a satellite may happen to fall on us that day right through the roof of our homes. Highly unlikely, it's happened, meteorites have fallen, people have actually survived meteorites, okay, or lightning, whatever, what they call an act of God in the insurance industry. At any rate, there's always a certain level of risk to health or life in just being alive, okay? So that's like, let's say that's like a background risk level, right? That goes into the statistical model. And that's the challenge, always being back and forth between probabilistic and deterministic models here. But anyway, back to the human embryo specifically, we're talking about a pregnancy. So we could look at globally what is the natural, normal risk of a pregnancy loss, all right? A natural pregnancy loss throughout the whole 9 months. And that number is a fuzzy number. What do I mean by a fuzzy number? It has a wide margin of error, because how do you, can we actually measure accurately all of the, or rather precisely, you know, to certain decimal points of a percentage, the number of, what am I talking about? I'm talking about spontaneous abortions and miscarriages, contrasted to birthing, to the babies are actually born alive. That would give us a fraction. In other words, let's say 5 out of 10 pregnancies in a sample. Let's say we take a sample population of women who are pregnant, and 5 out of those 10 women, we have a sample of 10 women, 5 made it to term. The other 5 did not make it to term naturally, without any intervention. Okay, so they either had a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage, same thing, just different chronology on the pregnancy. And so that would be the natural rate of pregnancy loss in the human population, which comes 5 out of 10 comes out to a 50% globally. The challenge is not so much in the miscarriage, because once we have a fetus, then it's easier to determine. Sadly, tragically, the woman lost that child. Just last week, I got a call from a good friend of mine from way back from 40 years ago when I was at another parish, 35 years ago, that she lost her pregnancy. Of course, she was in her 40s, you know? And most likely, in fact, at one point she had, the sonogram looked like she had twins, and then the one twin was no longer there, just the other one with a very low heartbeat. Remember we talked about Vanishing Twin? Okay, it's probably a case that happened, Vanishing Twin. It's amazing. I was talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and I get this call last week. Yeah, but she lost her pregnancy. It was about 10 weeks of gestation. So it was a natural loss, okay? It's sad, but it's real, it happens. At any rate, the overall, yeah, and the challenge is measuring, actually getting an accuracy on the spontaneous abortions, because those, since they happen before the 8 weeks, sometimes it's just a clot, right, that has inside the little tiny embryo. But the embryo is so tiny and sometimes even microscopic that the woman doesn't realize she's actually having a loss. She doesn't realize she's pregnant. She may think she's just late in her period, but it's actually a pregnancy loss, okay? So that's the fuzziness of the number comes from there. But globally, depending on who you read, some people actually put it higher, 70, I've seen articles, 80% pregnancy loss in humans, natural, meaning that, you know, 8 out of 10 pregnancies will not make it to term. That's a very high number. We seem to have one of the highest pregnancy losses in nature, okay? At any rate, if we take 50% as a reasonable number for pregnancy loss in humans, natural pregnancy loss, that means that we are not allowed to risk the life of this blastocyst more than 50%. So how do we get a 50% risk and no greater? Well, if you consider, just follow it with your mind's eye, if we only implant one at a time gives a 50% chance. Why? Because that one has only 2 options. That blastocyst either implants or doesn't implant, okay? And so that's the 50% right there. All right. That's how I see it, how theologically it could be justified to rescue these embryos, to adopt actually one of these human embryos. Again, if the couple is married validly in the eyes of God, it's a heterosexual couple. Obviously, they need to have the wherewithal to raise the child, okay, financially and otherwise, maturity, etc. And that it's only one implantation at a time. The challenge, though, with this, if we continue the argument forward and we try to implement it, all right, what does this do to the in vitro industry? Again, I'm being very straightforward here, and I know I've had a number of pushback over the years with my position, but considering that in vitro fertilization is such a gross injustice on the human population, especially these in vitro babies, who many of them don't even know they're in vitro, and all the consequences, the negative, horrible consequences that can have, including at some point when these in vitro babies grow up, because they're not going to stay babies forever, right? They grow up, they go into their 20s, they start falling in love with each other, and they may actually have the same father who was a sperm donor, who was a very vigorous sperm that was sold to many clinics, all right, etc. It has happened already, that they don't know that this young man and this young woman who are falling in love with each other, they're actually half brother and sister because they come from the same sperm bank. And then they have the abnormal children because they're half brother and half sister. And they didn't know because no one told them. And it's illegal actually to say the names of the donor, right? So you see the inherent injustice of this industry is just nefarious, it's horrible. But it's touted as a great advance in medicine. I told you the two doctors who invented this thing, Dr. Steptoe and Dr. Who's the other one? Forget the other name, I'm sorry. Steptoe and senility setting in. No, it wasn't Johnson. Edwards, Dr. Edwards and Steptoe. Okay. They were given the Nobel Prize a few years ago in medicine for the great advancement of IVF, okay, to the world. So anyway, you see the injustice there, and by rescuing these cryopreserved embryos, all right, we're actually giving the IVF industry another way out for legitimizing the embryos. So they can say to the couple who is coming to have the procedure with the hyperovulation and the spare embryos in the tank, and this couple may have some scruples and say, well, what am I going to do with those spare embryos if I already implant 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but there's still 8 more, you know, in the tanks? And the industry will say, oh, don't worry, because there will be these other infertile couples who will come and rescue those embryos, who will adopt those embryos. Okay, so you're actually contributing beyond getting your own children, you're going to give these children to that other couple too. Of course, that other couple is also going to be charged several $1,000s for the whole thing. That's not mentioned, but the point is that now this couple feels more relaxed about having spare embryos in the tank because something good will come out of those, you see. So that's the downside that I see of legitimizing this rescue, this adopting of the snowflake embryos, because we're just giving one more way out for the IVF industry to continue with its practice, okay? Okay, I think I've spoken my piece on that. I wrote a little article a few years ago, send it to you, you can take a look. I want to move forward unless there are any questions or comments. Okay, let's go forward to this other procedure. Still, we're looking at this whole arena of conception in the human, all right? A couple who cannot conceive naturally. And there are a number of reasons why a couple doesn't conceive. I'm going to hold off on that until I get to the IVF, to natural family planning. But basically, a couple who cannot conceive, and sometimes it is insufficient number of sperm, as simple as that. The man is not producing 100 million, it may be producing less than 10 million, all right? So that technically, clinically is not considered competent sperm, competent semen, because it has such a low number of sperm in the ejaculation, all right? So clinically, again, keep in mind it's a statistical thing. Clinically is considered incompetent, right? So what the clinic can do is enhance, try to get the fewer sperm to where they're supposed to go, which is the fallopian tube for fertilization. You follow? And that's artificial insemination. You notice that it's not the same word as in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization, that phrase describes exactly what is happening. It is an extracorporeal fertilization, in vitro, in glass, in the lab, all right? So the fertilization is outside the body of the woman, extracorporeal. Artificial insemination, AI, is not in vitro, and therefore it is in vivo. It is in vivo. It's within the body of the woman, within her reproductive tract. But the idea is simply to enhance the sperm to get there. And this cannula is actually kind of small. There are other cannulas that are even longer. And that cannula, which is flexible, will be inserted all the way close to the ampulla where the egg is, all right? Of course, this is all ultrasound guided so that to get the fewer sperm as close as possible to the egg itself, all right? In the ampulla, which is where normal fertilization should happen. That's the in vivo fertilization. You follow? So that's artificial insemination. Because artificial insemination happens in vivo, the actual fertilization happens in vivo, that's the desire, all right? It's not replacing the place, the locus. The place of fertilization is not being substituted. So this can be considered an assistance to fertilization, not a substitution. And that distinction between assisting or substituting is a key bioethical distinction. We'll run into that same distinction at the end of life when we talk about assisting vital organs or substituting vital organs. So listen carefully to what I'm saying, please, because this is not only a philosophical distinction, it is also a theological distinction, and it is an existential distinction. And the distinction is this: the distinction between assisting or substituting. In the case of beginning of life, assisting or substituting fertilization. In the case of the end of life, it's going to be assisting or substituting a vital organ. Okay? Okay, so we'll get to that in a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks when we start, next month when we get into end of life. But now here back to beginning of life, precisely at the beginning, the actual event of fertilization is critical, where it occurs in place or out of place. In other words, in the natural place or in a non-natural place, which by default is an artificial place, the lab, see? And that is the substitution of fertilization. So fertilization either occurs in vivo or in vitro. In vivo is the natural place. In vitro is the artificial place. And that is a substitution that we're just not entitled to do. We don't have a right to substitute the place of fertilization. Why? Because this is a vital event. This is a vital event that we just don't have the ontological right to change, the anthropological right to change. Again, because we're obviating all of the natural process that occurs in that fertilization at the biochemical level, okay? So, bottom line, from principle ethics, all right, from principle ethics, fertilization, human fertilization needs to occur in place, in the ampulla. But we could justify assisting that fertilization the maximum possible to the hilt, which is getting that sperm as close as possible to the egg, all right? And that's what we're talking about here with artificial insemination. The insemination is artificial, but it's not necessarily unethical because it's not substituting fertilization, it is assisting it. You follow? And typically is this, it's trying to get the sperm where it's supposed to go. It could be that the sperm, that there is the 100 million, for example, in the ejaculate, but they have a short tail or they have no tail, right? So that's another case where clinically AI could be used. So it could be justified, but again, the same provisions apply. The couple should be a heterosexual couple. It should be their own biological material, you know, the actual father, the biological father, the husband should be the provider of the sperm. The mother should be, the wife should be the one who's getting inseminated, etc. All those conditions should be in place, okay? So AI could potentially be justified ethically under principle of bioethics, but these provisions have to be in place. There's a further detail. Again, if we're going to stay consistent with a principled bioethics across the board, there is still the question of what? How to obtain, because this sperm needs to go into a cannula, right? How to obtain the sperm ethically without masturbation. Okay? How to obtain the sperm ethically without masturbation. It can be done. It's a little cumbersome and untasteful, if you will, distasteful for the married couple. But if you follow the argument, again, speaking with responsible adults here, we follow the argument. The couple, the married couple, is having their natural intercourse, the natural intimacy, and what the man will wear, the husband will wear a perforated condom. All right? So the perforated condom, first of all, has to be a condom that doesn't have any spermicide inside, because some condoms are coated with the spermicide inside to assist in the, to try to kill that sperm. And it's perforated so that sperm and semen can actually go through the condom. All right? What does that mean? That the condom is not being used as a contraceptive because the condom is perforated. And so semen and sperm can get through the condom. All right? So it's not being used as a contraceptive. It's being used as a bag to collect semen with sperm. That's what it's being used as. You follow? And so within the natural intimacy, they will use a perforated condom. Now, you're not going to find perforated condoms in the market because it defeats the purpose, right? You're going to find condoms. So the couple just has to take that condom and perforate it, like with a pin or something like that, and then go ahead and have their intimacy. Immediately after the intimacy, after the ejaculation, that condom will now go into a Ziploc bag, a clean bag, doesn't have to be sterile, but has to be clean, Ziploc bag, and sent to the lab right away. What they do in the lab is they wash the sperm, and then they concentrate the sperm, centrifuge it and concentrate it, and then that washed and clean sperm will then go into the cannula. You follow? So it also means that this couple has to time that particular intercourse to where the woman is ovulating, right? So that the sperm has a better chance for fertilizing. Because if the woman is not ovulating, you can put millions of sperm in there and there's nothing to fertilize. So on the woman's part, she has to, again, time herself so that she's ovulating, which implies natural family planning, so that the woman will know her time of ovulation, because that's the crux of natural family planning, is that the woman can actually tell from 10 symptoms of her body that she's about to ovulate or she's actually ovulating. Follow? Okay, so that's a way that technically sperm may be collected ethically without having to resort to masturbation, but the whole procedure has to be done rather quickly, and it's awkward to have this cumbrance of collecting the sperm, you know, in their intimacy. But if they're seeking a child, honestly, and he has this kind of sperm incompetence, then this is one way of assisting or enhancing the possibility of fertilization. Follow? But at the end of the day, that fertilization itself happens where it's supposed to happen, in the ampulla of the wife. All right? Okay, moving forward. What happens in practice? Because all of this is a little cumbersome, or quite cumbersome for couples to undergo all this stuff, it's much easier to go the IVF route. So you find few clinics that will do AI, simply because it's more cumbersome, and it's much easier, pragmatic, utilitarian to go through IVF, and they get it done, and there's a higher rate of assurance because they actually have the embryo now that has been manufactured, and with the excess embryos that are produced and so forth, they can actually give the couple a higher percentage of chance of actually getting pregnant. So all this technique, again, being cumbersome for a low percentage of success, gets bypassed through IVF with a very high percentage of success because they just keep inserting more and more embryos until one actually implants. And so for couples who are not concerned about justifying the means, they just go through IVF instead, right? You follow? But anyway, I have to cover it because AI can be justified ethically, maybe justified under those conditions. Now, another circumstance, we still have two other details to cover here, which are aside from IVF, just pregnancy in general, whether it's IVF or not. One is ectopic pregnancy, and the other one is a pregnant woman who happens to develop cancer of the uterus specifically, or the reproductive organ in general, okay? So two separate cases. Let's look at ectopic pregnancy first. Ectopic pregnancy is when the implantation happens in a place other than the endometrium where it's supposed to happen, okay? The implantation. So I'm talking about implantation, which means normally it's what? It's the blastocyst who implants, right? And therefore, fertilization has already occurred. This could come about either through IVF or through a normal pregnancy, through a normal in vivo fertilization, okay? Either way. The point here is that the fertilization itself is already completed. We're now talking about a blastocyst who got stuck somewhere along the way and not implanted where he or she was supposed to implant, which is the endometrium, the wall, the lateral wall of the uterus. So just for comparison, I have here in this diagram, the upper left is just a normal pregnancy, implanted, the embryo implants on the side of the wall of the endometrium, right? You see how it's thickened, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that's normal pregnancy. However, sometimes the blastocyst, the embryo, excuse me, like I mentioned, can either get stuck or actually fall out, right? Squeeze out of where he's supposed to go and cause an ectopic pregnancy. So typically, the most frequent ectopic pregnancy is known as a tubal pregnancy. In other words, along the fallopian tube, either in the ampulla itself, where fertilization occurred. It means that this little embryo never progressed down the tube, stayed there in the ampulla, and began to implant, all right? Very dangerous, very risky. Or further down the tube, but not all the way, it's called isthmic. This region is the isthmus, or in other words, before the bend and after the uterus, okay? Or actually, corneal is a reference to cornus, which is a horn, is the beginning of the tube, all right? But not quite at the endometrium, the beginning of the tube. Again, none of these are natural places for a pregnancy to occur, because if you follow forward this pregnancy and this embryo begins to grow, those organs, those tissues are not prepared to sustain a pregnancy. So typically they're going to stretch to a point, they're going to bulge to a point where they're going to burst. And that will cause a massive hemorrhage, because we know that the reproductive organs, just like many internal organs of the body, are highly vascularized, right? It means that they have a lot of capillaries. And when those burst, it causes a massive hemorrhage, and the woman can die soon, within hours, maybe less. And so it's a very risky condition, right? I mentioned that the embryo also can fall out of the reproductive tract, because remember that the fimbri, these little fingers, and the infundibulum, this area looks like a little hand, like a glove, all right? It's called infundibulum. That infundibulum is not actually attached to the ovary, it's hovering over it. And that's why it moves a little bit okay, a few millimeters. But there's actually a gap, and since these early cells and embryos and tissues are microscopic, they can certainly slip through a crack, all right, through a gap. Because we're talking about microscopic structures here. The blastocyst is about the same size as the egg, even though the blastocyst is more developed than the egg and the zygote. Anyway, the blastocyst can actually slip out in between the infundibulum and the ovary and end up in an abdominal pregnancy, in the abdomen. In the abdomen, and that will generate a placenta that will attach to the viscera. In fact, I remember one time seeing one article. There was this woman who had developed an extrauterine pregnancy, an abdominal pregnancy, and the placenta had actually attached along the intestinal walls, and for some miraculous reason had not penetrated the intestines, had not ruptured anything, and the pregnancy was carried to viability. First, she was feeling pain. There was a bulge. They thought she had a tumor or cancer. And then with the ultrasound, they realized she was actually having an extrauterine pregnancy. And the embryo had grown, actually fetus had grown to viability size, all right? More than 20 weeks, 23 weeks is now considered viability. And so they were able to they opened her up and actually rescue the fetus and put the fetus in an incubator in the NICU unit and lived. But that's very, very rare. Most of those pregnancies are very dangerous and high risk for the mother, of course, because of the invasiveness of the placenta. You know, the placenta tissue is relentless in looking for capillaries precisely and can rupture anything along its way. Okay? So another case would be if the sperm actually slips out all the way and there was no actual ovulation yet, but the follicle was about to burst or bursting, the follicle, but actually got inseminated, got fertilized before rupturing, okay? And now you have an ovarian pregnancy. Or that the blastocyst reversed direction and actually implanted into the tissue of the ovary. Okay, so again, rare, you see the percentages there approximately, but it can occur. Finally, two others would be that the embryo lodges too far down into the uterus, close to the cervix. Okay, also very dangerous because that placenta may cover the cervical opening and there will be no space, and it's too narrow down there in the neck of the uterus for the actual fetus to grow, certainly full term, all right? May be able to make it to viability, I don't really know, but it's not the normal natural place, okay? So high risk. Finally, the last one is if the blastocyst gets stuck in the scar of a C-section. Okay, cesarean section, typically they're done very low. Now, there used to be, well, the original C-sections were vertical and very drastic, cutting through all the 7 layers, I think they are, of muscle tissue. But now they're done horizontally and low. In fact, so this more advanced C-section allows for multiple pregnancies. It used to be when a woman had a single C-section, originally vertical, she could not have any more pregnancies. The uterus was disabled, could not handle any more pregnancy because it would rupture right through here, through the growth of the fetus. But now being so low, there's plenty of room in the uterus for the fetus to grow, and she can have several pregnancies. I think it's maybe 3 or 4 with C-section, not exactly sure. At any rate, that's another one where there could be some scarring on the inside of the uterus, and an embryo can also get stuck there, not the proper place. So a downside of doing the C-section lower, okay, which is done lower precisely to maintain the integrity of the fundus of the uterus. Okay, so these ectopic pregnancies, are essentially high risk for the mother, for the pregnant mother, and they have to be managed very, very carefully. Okay? Now, the silver lining and the happy ending of this is that about 90% of ectopic pregnancies resolve on their own. In other words, typically the blastocyst, the early embryo, dies and is reabsorbed by the tissue, or the mother actually gets to pass and dislodge that tissue and that embryo and will discard him or her natural, normal, which would be then a spontaneous abortion, okay? So almost all, 90% of these ectopic pregnancies resolve on their own. Therefore, the protocol is what they call expectant management. Expectant management is just to observe, keep observing the mother in her growth of the pregnancy and do a periodical ultrasound and auscultation and so forth until it either resolves or not, okay? And when it becomes, when the embryo doesn't dislodge and it's not reabsorbed by the mother's tissue or anything like that, and the pregnancy continues, then there's a critical time, which I don't know exactly what that time is, but early on, beyond which that pregnancy cannot be sustained, all right? And then there has to be an intervention, a clinical medical intervention. So there are two types, generally two types of interventions, and typically it's going to be surgical and or chemical. So the classical surgical intervention is known as a salpingectomy, all right? Salpingectomy, which is essentially the removal of the tube. Again, because more than 90% of ectopic pregnancies are tubal pregnancies, somewhere along the tube, all right? Basically, the tube is removed, the tube. You notice if we take these 3 or 4 here, yeah, because the tube can be removed even at the base here. We take these 4, we add it up, 70 plus 12 is 82, plus 11 is 93, plus 2 is 95. Yeah, 95, okay, so there's a number. 95 to 96% of the pregnancies are tubal pregnancies. That's the vast majority of them, okay? So what the salpingectomy does is it cuts on both sides of the pregnant tube and takes out the pregnant tube and goes to biomedical waste, okay? Yes, the fetus dies. The fetus though, sorry, embryo is not killed, dies. Now, it's a ethical distinction. The tube is excised, it's taken out, it's cut out. Of course, the embryo is inside that tube, but the embryo is not touched directly. There's no direct intervention of the embryo, so the embryo is left intact. It is obviously known that that embryo will die because that embryo has no support system, right? But notice, critical that the embryo itself is left intact. The embryo, I'm sorry, himself or herself is not acted upon, okay? It's the tube, because what happens? When we have a tubal pregnancy or any ectopic pregnancy, the tube itself has become pathological. See, we have now a fallopian tube that is pathological because it is carrying a pregnancy and it's not designed to carry a pregnancy. So there's a pathology on that tube. And what the salpingectomy does by cutting the tube out, it is taking care of that pathology. It is addressing the pathology. So it's restoring the reproductive system back to health. It is taking care of the pathology. You can see it analogous, but not identical to a tumor on the fallopian tube, all right? There's a pathology. What is the protocol? The protocol is to excise that pathology to take it out. Of course, negative consequences. It renders a woman infertile on that tube. The other tube is still intact, so that on average, the salpingectomy has reduced the fertility rate of the woman by 50%. But the other tube, in principle, is still intact, all right? So that's a downside, that's a negative consequence of the salpingectomy. But the crucial point here that I'm stressing is that the embryo is not attacked directly. It's left alone. So a second tragic thing, or the first tragic thing, is that this embryo will die. When this tube now that has been excised is taken out, where's the tube going to go? The tube is going to go into a red biohazard bag. And that biohazard bag is going to be incinerated at the end of the workday in that hospital or clinic as medical waste, together with whatever other organ was excised that day, a pancreas, etc. Okay? And so this embryo will die as medical waste. But my point about the killing is that the embryo was not killed directly. In other words, this is a tragic, the death of the embryo is a tragic consequence of a pathology that is life-threatening to the mother because it did not resolve.
The mother had an accident while being pregnant.
Exactly. It's a good analogy. Thank you. Exactly. So let's say that the mother is pregnant, the woman is pregnant, is driving, okay, and it can happen that she has an accident. She didn't cause the accident, or even if she caused the accident, she didn't will to kill her unborn baby, but the unborn baby died from the impact. Okay, so it's a tragic loss, but it was not willed. And so that's what allows the salpingectomy, and it's allowed because of the principle of double effect that I'll talk about in a minute. But I first want to describe the physiological issue that is going on here before getting into the actual bioethical, okay? So, whereas salpingostomy is a different type of surgery. Salpingostomy actually can be done either chemically or surgically, but sticking with the surgical salpingostomy, what it does is they cut the tube, right? They make an incision lengthwise on the tube and scrape out the embryo. Scrape out the embryo with a scalpel, all right? So what happens? In this case, in the case of the salpingostomy, the procedure directly targets the embryo and is scraping the embryo out. And of course, that's going to kill the embryo, all right? So the positive thing about the salpingostomy is that it tends to preserve the tube intact so that the woman doesn't lose 50% of her fertility, right? So in principle, it's a better clinical solution for an ectopic pregnancy, especially for a tubal pregnancy, when the embryo is just scraped out. That embryo has no chance of survival anyway, but then we have to finish that thought. So why not kill him or her if he or she is going to die anyway? Well, if we use that argument and bring it to logical consistency, we're all going to die sooner or later anyway. So why not just kill any one of us, because we're going to die anyway, right? Follow? So it's not a logical consistency, really. But anyway, the salpingostomy is going directly after the embryo and supposedly leaving the tube intact. However, again, the devil is in the detail, because by making a slit incision on that tube, scraping the embryo out, now what do we have? Well, we have a tube with a slit, but now the embryo is no longer there, but then that slit, that cut, incision has to be sewed. You know, it's called anastomosis. Okay, imagine the little tiny curved needle with little tiny hair thread, which typically is biodegradable. Okay, they have to sew that back together, and yes, that may leave a scar, especially on the inside. Who cares about the scar on the outside of the tube? But the scar on the inside, even if that scar is microscopic, what normally goes through that tube, or who goes through that tube? A blastocyst, who is also microscopic. So even if the scar is microscopic, a salpingostomy may be setting up the scenario for a future ectopic pregnancy on the same tube. You follow? By that little roadblock of the scar tissue. And so even clinically, it's not that good, but it can be sold as preserving the fertility of the woman intact. Well, theoretically. In practice, we'll see. It can be also that, yes, that scar on the inside could be temporary, and eventually the tube will fully recover from the inside. A lot has to do with the age of the woman, right? The age of the mother and so forth, and how her tissue is regenerating and so forth. But it could be that that scar on the inside is temporary, or it could be permanent. No one will know, especially if it's at the macroscopic level. We really have no way of determining that, right? Okay, so those are the challenges with salpingostomy, is that it's going after the embryo himself or herself, and therefore it's an erect attack. We're not allowed, in principle bioethics, to intervene directly on the embryo by killing him or her, all right? But the salpingectomy is justified for this, what we call this principle of double effect. So the principle of double effect is very useful in bioethics, especially in clinical bioethics, biomedical ethics, because it allows for a number of procedures that have both a good effect and a bad effect simultaneously from the procedure itself, okay? So how do we justify a procedure that has both a good effect and a bad effect? Like, for example, the salpingostomy. Salpingectomy that has the good effect of taking care of an ectopic pregnancy, high risk to the mother, but the bad effect simultaneously is the death of the embryo. Okay, well, these 5 steps need to be in place for double effect to take place and to be justified, right? So let's look at the conditions. First of all, the act in itself must be a good act or morally indifferent, morally neutral. In other words, the excising of the tube is a good act in the sense that it's seeking, I wonder if I can do this, oh, that's as far as I can go. Maybe able to see it a little bit. Right. Why is excising the tube a good act or neutral? It's actually a good act because remember, the tube is pathological. Clinically, there's a pathology, right? So removing that tube is something good and positive. We're not going to remove a healthy tube. That is actually sterilization. That is non-therapeutic sterilization, okay? So that is not justified. But a pathological tube, the proper procedure, the proper protocol is to excise it, to remove it. Secondly, the good effect must not be obtained by means of the evil effect. In other words, there cannot be a direct correlation of the good effect flowing from the evil itself. The reason why the tube is removed is because it has become pathological. Why has it become pathological? It has become pathological because the placenta will develop there, will start growing there and likely rupture that tube, okay? Because a fallopian tube is not meant to sustain a placental pregnancy. And therefore, it is removing that pathology. It is not that by removing the embryo directly, which would be the evil effect or the bad effect, the pathology is taken care of. Okay? So it's the issue of the actual tissue of the placenta going into the tube that makes for the pathology. The third condition, the evil must not be intended. In other words, the doctor, the surgeon who is doing the salpingectomy should not desire to kill the embryo. Should not desire that the embryo should die. The mother who is consenting to the procedure should not desire that the embryo should die, all right? But it is permitted, it is allowed, not desired, but allowed, because it has to happen. Now, we could ask, well, is there an ethical obligation to try to implant that embryo into the womb? And the answer is no, there is no ethical obligation to try to implant that. Why wouldn't there be? If we don't want to kill the embryo, if we don't desire to kill the embryo, shouldn't we try to rescue the embryo and try to implant the embryo? Again, theoretically, yes, but again, the devil is in the detail. Imagine, how are we going to implant that embryo into the uterus? You have to think of the clinical steps. Are we just going to put the whole tube in there? Or are we going to open the tube and slap it up against the uterus, hoping that the embryo will transfer over? How are we going to do that surgically without risking the health or the life of this embryo further? You see? Oh, but the embryo is going to die anyway. Yeah, but the embryo is going to die is one thing. But doing a direct intervention on the embryo may bring about the actual death of the embryo, which then now we're culpable of the death of that embryo. Okay? So to this day, with the clinical techniques that we have, it's not really possible to implant this embryo into the womb. It's too high a risk for the embryo. All right, because now we're intervening directly on the embryo. So we just have to let the embryo go. It's a tragic, I'll give you an example. One time, we went for a picnic. My parents, my brother and I, we went for a picnic. My brother and I were teenagers. And we were living in Mexico. We went out in the countryside and it was a nice lake there and we're having a picnic along the shore. And there's a boat of two young men and they're rowing in this boat at a distance in the lake. Okay, we can see them at a distance. These two young men start fooling around on top of the boat and moving back and forth and wrestling. One of them fell over. Unbeknownst to us, turns out the guy didn't know how to swim. And he started drowning. Right there, it was tragic, it was horrible. Okay, and we're watching this. And my dad, we were teenagers, we were young. My brother and I were maybe 12, 13 years old, something like that. My dad, who had been an Eagle Scout and good constitution, wanted to jump in and try to save the guy. And my mother told him, please don't do it. Okay, because she risked the prospect. If you don't really know how to rescue a person who is drowning, they'll drown you because they'll try to climb on top of you. But there's nothing to get a foothold. They'll literally try to climb on top of you because they're dying, they're gasping for air. And it's a split-second thing, it's within seconds. And so my mother told him, and we're all crying in distress, watching this guy drown. In fact, the fellow who was in the boat still reached out and grabbed him and pulled him out by the hair, pulled him out, okay? And I remember distinctly to this day, I mean, it's been 60 years. His face was red, was blood red because he has already, and then he lost him again because of the when he started pulling out, of course, the person became more and more heavy, all right? And lost him again and just ended up with a wad of hair in his hand. That's when my dad wanted to jump in. And I remember thinking to my mom, said, don't do it, please don't do it. Don't leave me as a widow. Okay. So was there an obligation to jump in? There was no obligation. Maybe if my dad had been a life saver, lifeguard, and had the professional training on how to rescue a drowning person, maybe, but he didn't. And so he didn't jump in. And that was a tragic scenario where we just had to watch this fellow die, okay? We didn't kill him, but there was really practically nothing we can do. We really did not have the capacity to save him. And so that's the thing here. It is a life-threatening situation for the mother. Keep in mind, this pregnancy has not resolved. This pregnancy, ectopic pregnancy, has not resolved on its own. Okay, so an intervention needs to be done quickly. But we have to leave the embryo alone. Tragically, this embryo was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Professor, is it possible that the industry, they are not interested invest on these 5% of ectopic pregnancy because science has advanced so much that there are very specific surgeries that can be done now?
Possibly to rescue the embryo, perhaps, possibly, yes. And I confess my ignorance in this because this is research that I did several years ago, precisely for my first dissertation in the 90s. It could be that today there is such a progress that this embryo can actually be rescued and therefore with a low enough risk, right? So that both the mother and the child will live. Possibly, yes, I would have to update myself on this, but I'm using this scenario more for the explanation of the principle of double effect, right? Which is, yeah. So the conditions, to illustrate the conditions of the principle of double effect, okay? That the evil is not intended in itself, but it's permitted because we see it coming. All right. Finally, well, the fourth, typically you see the principle of double effect with 4 conditions, but I added this 5th one, which is obvious, but some people don't realize it, that this has to be in place, should actually be the first one, you know, that it's the last resort, there's no other alternative. But the first one is this proportionality, okay? Proportionality. In other words, there's a grave reason. And the grave reason essentially in this case is the life of the mother. The very life of the mother is at stake. And that's the grave reason. So it's really life for life, all right? So it's not something that is less threatening to the mother, to the health of the mother, but it's actually a life. And therefore, there is proportionality between the 2 outcomes. Okay, and finally, yeah, that it's a last resort. This should be obvious that there is no other alternative available, because if there is, then obviously one should choose the other alternative. Okay, so those are the 5 conditions that should be in place, and then it can be justified for this principle of double effect, all right? Finally, the other case for applying double effect is when a woman is pregnant, a normal pregnancy in the proper place, in the endometrium of the uterus, but she also develops cancer, either of the uterus or the reproductive tract as a whole, all right? And so this doesn't have to do with ectopic pregnancy. This could be either the result of in vitro or in vivo fertilization, regardless, but now we have a pregnancy, okay? We have a pregnancy and the woman develops cancer, or the cancer was there undetected and progressed to the point that now the cancer is detected in the uterus or the reproductive system in general. What to do? Well, what's the protocol for cancer? The protocol for cancer is chemotherapy and radiotherapy and so forth. And that therapy will affect the human embryo, of course. Okay, cause mutations, may kill the embryo. And yet we can justify the therapy because of double effect again, right? Because of double effect. And the therapy may also involve a hysterectomy, which is excising either the uterus or the ovaries or wherever the cancer is. Okay? But the fact is that the embryo, again, because of the therapy or the protocol that's going to be used, then the embryo will die. So again, double effect applies in the sense that here we'll be talking about a normal pregnancy. Okay? Whatever organ in the protocol, let's say chemotherapy will harm, damage the embryo, and the embryo will die. Tragic, foreseeing, we can foresee the tragedy, but it is not willed or intended, and therefore it may be allowed because with the progression of the cancer most likely will kill the mother. So again, it's a grave reason. It's proportionate, okay? It's justified. And that's the other case where double effect applies is a pregnant woman who develops cancer. In fact, the cancer could be elsewhere in the body and she'd still take the chemo, and that chemo could affect the embryo, right? Now, the woman could also opt for not doing the chemo, and that's called heroic, but it's not required, okay? So the chemo can be justified ethically, morally, if she's pregnant, knowing that the embryo will die from that chemo. But she can also refuse the treatment and abide by the consequences, which will be typically lethal to her. We also have a case of women who have done this, and the most notable case is this Italian lady, Gianna Molla. I don't know if you've heard of her, maybe. But she has become very famous. She's now blessed, Gianna Molla. And Gianna was a doctor in Italy, medical doctor, OBGYN, okay? She had 2 babies already, or maybe she had 1 baby. But the point is that she was pregnant again, and, oh no, she had 2 babies already. Okay, so this is more informative. Gianna had two children already. She became pregnant again, and then she developed cancer. And she said no to the therapy. She rejected therapy in conscience. She was not obligated to reject the therapy, like she said. It could have been totally justified, ethically justified in her double effect, but she wanted to give life to her baby. And so she did that. She rejected the therapy. She went through the 9 months of pregnancy. The baby was born healthy, and then she died from the cancer, okay? Of course, her husband also had to be in agreement with that. The husband had to be in agreement, which he was, and it was a sacrifice. It was heroic, like I said, but this is what her conscience told her to do, so she did it. And she has been proclaimed blessed in the Catholic Church. When she was beatified, her husband was at the beatification mass in the Vatican with the 3 children, you know, and her mom, her wife, was being beatified. And so she's a very courageous example. Like I say, again, this is heroic. This is not required, but it is an option. Okay, it is an option, and it's an option that is based on the fact that we're here for a time. But there was this new life that she had a chance to give new life, you know, to her child. Instead of her continuing to live, let her child live instead, okay? So it was sacrificial. And as a consequence of this, a number of women, since she did this, a number of women over the years have followed her example, of course, with the consent of her husband especially, but they have followed her example, and now we have more cases that have done this. You can look it up online, but these are examples that edify. Of course, not everyone is called to this act of heroism, but I can say that it can be also ethically justified, all right? Okay, let me stop there. Again, I've covered a lot of ground here in relatively little time. Some of this has been new to you, I'm sure, so you need some time to reflect and consider, ponder it, but I'm being consistent with the principal ethics, as you can see, principal bioethics, in which the means also have to be justified, all right? Not just the end, but the means itself. Of course, when we get into utilitarian ethics, many of these arguments are irrelevant, they're pie in the sky, who cares, whatever means gets you there as long as it's legal, etc. But the only thing that counts really in utilitarian ethics is the end that is ethical, justifiable, it's a good end, and then whatever means, as long as it's not illegal, right? I mean, that's the honest truth, and some utilitarians may admit the honest truth, and others may not admit it, but I'm presenting it for you to consider that that is the bottom line truth. The only one that stands really on principle of justifying the means is going to be principled ethics, principled bioethics. Okay, time for a break. We need to thaw out here. So it's 11:20. I'm going to pause until 11:30 and start up again with natural family planning, all right? So let me pause this. Okay, welcome back. So let's go into the second half here, which will be on natural family planning. Finally, we get to what is considered the healthy alternative in principle bioethics, healthy alternative to either contraception for avoiding children or IVF for having children or seeking to have children, okay? Natural family planning. All right, the first thing I want to say about natural family planning is that it is not the rhythm, method, because the rhythm method is based on what is known as a post-ovulatory event. Post-ovulatory is after ovulation. Basically, the rhythm is based on menstruation, okay? But menstruation is not as accurate as the other 10 symptoms that I'm going to be telling you about that are either pre-ovulatory or right during the ovulation itself. Again, to review a little bit of the biology, remember that ovulation is where the follicle ruptures and there is a mature egg that will then move to the ampulla for potential fertilization. Actually, this one is a little more illustrative because I noticed that it has a follicle here that's about to rupture just on the diagram, okay? When this follicle ruptures, opens, and then this egg will move to the infundibulum. Of course, this, the infundibulum here is put very far away from the ovary for the purpose of illustration, okay? But it's not that far. It's much closer. It's just a little gap of a few millimeters there. It's not, the gap is not that big. This is a little better, okay? Right, so what do we have? We have the ovulation event, and like I'm saying, this ovulation event carries with it about 10 symptoms of the woman's body that she can detect these symptoms and then essentially know when she is ovulating, all right? And then that information is powerful. Like I tell the young ladies when I teach this in the undergraduate course, is this gives you tremendous power because now you know when you're ovulating and you can make the proper ethical decisions according to that, okay? Very, very powerful, but it does require discipline and it requires, again, detail, to be attentive to the detail. So we're going to look first at the biology of it, as always, looking at the biological evidence that is for these 10 symptoms, and then we'll do the bioethical analysis based on that, all right? So let's go forward, natural family planning. It involves 10 symptoms, like I've mentioned, 3 of which are primary symptoms and 7 secondary symptoms. of the woman's body for her to be able to determine when she is ovulating. Again, the point here is that if there is no mature egg in the infundibulum there in the ampulla, then there's no pregnancy because there's no egg to be fertilized, right? So you have to be clear, crystal clear about the biology of what's going on here. I mentioned three primary symptoms because these are directly associated with the ovulation event of the woman. In other words, this is her body. As her body is ovulating, these three symptoms are directly associated with that ovulation event. The other 7 symptoms are like a side effect of the ovulation event itself, okay? There are other effects that happen simultaneously or around the same time. Okay, so obviously the 3 primary symptoms are the most accurate ones, because there's less variation. Every woman who is ovulating is going to go through these 3 primary symptoms necessarily. The other 7 are greater or lesser intensity depending on many factors, depending on the age of the woman, even her emotional state, her genotype, many different characteristics, okay? Her health, even the diet that she eats, whether she's exercising or not. So the 7 secondary symptoms are not as accurate. And that's why when there is a contradictory information, one goes with the primary symptoms because they're more accurate. And so the primary symptoms, the 3 primary symptoms are these. The basal body temperature, also known as BBT, right? The activity of the cervix and the cervical mucus. So we're going to look at each one of these in a little bit of detail. But before we do that, just for the sake of completion, we'll look at the 7 secondary symptoms, all right? And then talk a little bit about each one in some level of detail. Mittelschmerz, which is German for middle pain literally in the abdominal region, okay? Spotting, the swelling of the vagina or the vulva, accumulation of water, increased libido, breast tenderness, general bloating, and then ferning. The event of ferning, which is interesting, is actually estrogen throughout, higher amount of estrogen throughout a whole body, especially in the saliva of the woman. So we'll get to the 7 secondary symptoms in a minute. Let's go back to the 3 primary. Oh, before I look at detail into the symptoms. These are some major protocols that are promoting natural family planning, okay? And these are all online for free in various languages that people can get a lot of information from these places, all right, these sites. So these are the major ones, the Crichton model from Crichton University. And that one is called NAPRO Technology. Couple-to-couple league is another one, CCL. You find it online. Symptothermal method, which is kind of an offshoot from the Billings method, but includes the temperature, the BBT, all right? Billings was Dr. Billings, is the pioneer in this, goes back several decades. He's the one that did a lot of the initial research, especially on the mucus, the cervical mucus, which is by far the most accurate of all 10 symptoms. And then another one that I discovered, well, actually a friend of mine referred me to this one. He's a pediatrician and he uses this a lot with his patients. Family of the Americas. Family of the Americas is mostly based on Billings, but has some interesting characteristics. I'll talk a little bit more about Family of the Americas. In a moment, you can look it up online, Spanish and English. It was developed by the wife of an ex-president of Guatemala, okay, because she was Guatemala. We lived in Guatemala for a while with my family, and Guatemala has one of the highest index of illiteracy in Central America and all of Latin America because they have a very high Indian native population, mostly descendants of the Mayas and Quiche. So many of them don't even speak Spanish or understand Spanish, especially in the rural areas, okay? And so she developed this method that can be taught just iconographic without having to use words, verbosity, just with little images and icons. And it's very successful in the rural population of the Guatemalan people. Anyway, Mercedes Arzu is her name. So these are some models that you can look up online, like I say, for free with all the charting and everything else in Spanish, English, or any other language. So you have that reference. Okay, let's look at the three primary symptoms. The basal body temperature, the cervical activity, and the cervical mucus. First, the BBT, which is the least of the three methods, the three primary methods. It is primary because directly associated with ovulation, but it's not as accurate as the other two. What is BBT? We all have a BBT. In other words, our basal body temperature, also known just as what is the body temperature of the human? That's a real question. What is the body temperature? Centigrade or Fahrenheit? 37 Celsius or centigrade, right? 37, which is much higher than this room right now. And in Fahrenheit, that translates to the famous 98.6, right? Or 96.6. Sometimes I get it backwards. I think I have it in here. It's 98.6 or 96.8. Let's look it up. Yeah, of course, Celsius, but where is it? 98, 97.6, 98. All right, around there, around 98, okay, Fahrenheit. So that's the body temperature, the basal body temperature. What happens is that during ovulation or just before ovulation, the woman's body will get a little warmer, slightly, by 0.5 to 1 degree Fahrenheit. So it's very little, okay? 0.5 to 1 degree higher. It will have a little spike. So the body temperature will rise slightly just before ovulation. It's a natural phenomenon of the body, and it's just indicating that ovulation is about to occur. So that spike can be measured. The problem is because it's small. Now, there are now thermometers that are digital thermometers that measure down to a decimal to a centesimal. So we can measure a centesimal, and we can certainly measure a decimal of BBT with these new thermometers, right? And even records it digitally and saves it memory to look up later. But it's a little cumbersome because this is what happens. As soon as we wake up in the morning and start moving around, our temperature is going to start fluctuating back and forth, okay? And especially if we do activity, it's going to start rising and so forth. So the best way to monitor the BBT would be like very early in the morning before actually waking up or before getting up out of bed. So the couples who are following this method, she would typically set the alarm like at 5 or 6 in the morning, right? Alarm rings, she has a thermometer right next to her bed. She takes her temperature, whatever part, and then as soon as the beep sounds, puts the temperature aside and keeps sleeping, puts the thermometer aside, puts the thermometer aside, keeps sleeping until she's gonna wake up for the rest of the day. So, and then what she can do sometime during the day, go back to that thermometer and record the temperature on a chart. See, so it's a little cumbersome, it's discipline, and the best way to monitor this, the absolute best way to monitor it is always at the same time when that basal body temperature is at its lowest at rest, right? So before becoming active in the day. So that's why it's a little cumbersome, awkward, but it can be done for lots of discipline. It can be done. Charting this on a daily basis, what the woman would notice on average once a month on a cycle of 28 days, which is like the ideal cycle, all right? There would be a little spike of 0.5 to 1 degree Fahrenheit on that basal body temperature. And that would be indicating that ovulation is about to occur within hours, within 24 hours. All right, so that's the least accurate of the 3 symptoms. Also because if the woman has a low-grade fever, for example, maybe she has a local infection or something like that, a UTI, urinary tract infection or something, or any other kind of small infection that will cause a low-grade fever, that's going to give also an artificial rise in the temperature. You follow? It's an artificial rise, and it can be confused for the spike of ovulation. And that's why it's not as accurate as the other 2 symptoms that I'm going to be talking about. Okay? All right. Again, before moving forward, and it's getting colder and colder in here, you're welcome to the sweater. Sometimes wrapping it around the neck actually will bring our temperature, will help us maintain our BBT. All right. So let's look at the activity of the cervix and also the cervical mucus, which in order of priority, actually, the most accurate is going to be the cervical mucus, okay? I'll get there in a minute and you'll see why, actually. Well, here. All right, so the activity of the cervix. We know that the cervix is a circular muscle in between the uterus and the vagina, okay? And it's also known as a sphincter. We have several sphincters in our body. The mouth is also a sphincter. The anus is a sphincter. In other words, they are circular muscles that are smooth muscle, not skeletal muscle, not attached to bone, but smooth muscle, which is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We don't have control over it necessarily. The mouth also has skeletal muscles attached to it. But these sphincters are open and closed involuntarily by metabolism. All right. We also have sphincters at the opening of the stomach, at the beginning of the stomach, and at the end of the stomach, going from the esophagus to the stomach, going from the stomach to the intestines. There are sphincters there too. All right. Anyway, this cervix has activity that basically is letting the woman know when ovulation is occurring. Typically, when she's ovulating, the cervix will be high on the vaginal tract and will be relaxed and open, okay, slightly, as is shown here, and soft. When she's not ovulating, that cervix will drop and will close and tighten, okay? And even become off-center slightly, and will be what is known as firm and not soft, but firm. So the muscle is kind of shut down, okay? So that's the difference in the activity. When she's fertile, it will be soft, centered, and a little higher. And when she's not ovulating, the muscle essentially tightens, drops down. Its part of tightening is dropping down and firm, and also slightly off-center, okay? Because this is in preparation for the natural event of intercourse, which is what would bring about a fertilization, okay? So again, anatomically, speaking with mature adults here, what the cervix is trying to do is try to match up to the head of the penis in the intercourse so that it would line up at fertility, at the time of ovulation, so that the most amount of semen would go into the uterus, as opposed to the infertile time, when neither semen nor anything else is supposed to come into the reproductive tract of the woman, especially from the uterus. Keep in mind that really the vagina is not, the vagina is a tube, it's a flexible tube, it's a muscular tube, but really the real opening into the woman's body and the reproductive tract is the uterus, okay? So the uterus is to be protected from foreign objects coming in there. And therefore, the key event here is the cervix really is it's the gatekeeper, all right? So when she's not ovulating, nothing, including semen, should go through there because semen has no place inside, sperm has no place inside because there's no egg to be fertilized, all right? But when she is ovulating, by exception, if you will, the cervix will allow semen to come through so that fertilization may take place, okay? And so it's a natural event, and it's all controlled by hormones that are produced during the time of ovulation, the estrogen, higher level of estrogen, and so forth, to match up and to line up essentially to prepare the reproductive tract, the female reproductive tract, for the possibility of intercourse and therefore fertilization. All right? Keeping in mind that a lot of the semen, even with an open cervix, will not go into the uterus, will spill out in the vagina because that's where the head of the penis stops, okay? So we have to be in tune with the anatomy of what's going on. So a woman can detect this. A woman can detect this by self-exam. Typically, she will use the middle finger, which is the longest finger of the hand, and reach up through her vagina and detect with the tip of her finger what is the activity of the cervix. If it's high and moist and soft and kind of centered, or if it's low and firm, hard, and off-center and on the dry side, okay? And these two extremes can be detected, like I say, by the tip of the finger. Of course, hygiene is foremost here, crucial for her to wash her hands before the examination so that she doesn't infect herself, all right? So it's crucial to do that. But she can by a self-examination. And she can do this even on a daily basis, particularly for the couple who is either seeking to avoid children or seeking to have children. And there are charts that has the little diagrams. You can go online and look at the charts where they have a little diagram, like a little icon of what the cervix is supposed to look like. And then she can match that icon up to her self-exam. Follow? Okay, so that can be done in the privacy of her bathroom, and she will then become familiar with the activity of her cervix. The most accurate one by far is going to be the mucus itself, the cervical mucus, because the whole reproductive tract is producing mucus. Let me quickly go up here for a moment. Useful diagram. The whole reproductive tract is producing mucus on a regular basis, okay? And that mucus is naturally, normally flowing outward from the tubes, down the uterus, down out through the cervix to the vagina. There's a flow there, okay? But that flow is not uniform throughout every day, throughout the whole month, throughout the whole years. No, it's not uniform. It flows and ebbs and flows according to the cycle. Because when she is ovulating, the cervical mucus will change consistency, all right? It will actually biochemical change. That's why it's the most accurate, because it's down to the biochemical level. So when she's not ovulating, that mucus is kind of thick and it's called tacky. It's not elastic. It's not very elastic and it's opaque, all right? And that's the cervical mucus. In fact, it actually forms like a little plug on the inside of the uterus, because again, if there's no ovulation, there's no egg to be fertilized, nothing should get in through there, through the cervix, because it could be an infection to the woman. So the cervical mucus, when she's not ovulating, is again thick, not elastic, and opaque. They call it tacky, all right? When she is ovulating, which is at the other extreme, that same mucus, that cervical mucus, will become thin, elastic, and clear, and many times even more abundant. So this is actually the actual ovulation event here. They place it as if it were rain. It's raining, okay? So it's much more elastic, transparent, and thin, looking very much like the white of an egg, but uncooked egg, because you know when we cook an egg, the white actually turns white, right? La clara del huevo. It looks like that. That mucus has that consistency. It's flexible. It can be actually be stretched out an inch or beyond that and not break, all right? So you see the self-exam serves two purposes. As the woman is trying to determine the activity of the cervix, she will also pick up some of the mucus that is there. And then immediately check with the index finger, with the thumb and the middle finger, check what's going on. What is the consistency? What is the quality of that mucus? If it's elastic and transparent, or if it's thick and opaque and tacky. Well, that's the examination there. And then after that, she'll wash her hands again, but she needs to record. And then again, like these diagrams, this is precisely a photo from the Family of the Americas booklet that is available online. If she has this diagram in front, then she can just put the number, for example, on the chart on the day, what number is the mucus looking like, you see? And this is, again, going through 2 weeks, as you can see in the numbering system, from 1 to 15, where ovulation is occurring here between 8, 9, and 10. Okay. Now, a little further detail to understand actually why is the quality of the mucus changing, because it's the same mucus, but it changes mostly because of pH, which is also controlled by the hormones. And what happens is this. During fertility, during ovulation, this mucus at the biochemical level, at the molecular level, these are polymucosaccharides. They're very long chains, they're polymers at the molecular level, all right? And they form like highways, they're fibers, microscopic fibers that form like highways where the sperm travels. So the sperm would actually use these as a roadway during the fertile time to get to the egg. All right, that distance that the sperm has to travel all the way from the uterus up to the ampulla of the fallopian tube. So the mucus during the fertility, during the ovulation, serves as a highway for the sperm. That's why that mucus has several qualities for the sperm. It serves as a highway, as a transport. It also provides nutrition so that the sperm can actually live up to 5 days, 5 times longer than the sperm would naturally live. Right? Sperm outside of the female tract only lives about 24 hours, like in our bodies, in the man's body, and that sperm after 24 hours gets old, just like the egg gets old after 24 hours, and then it's discarded and typically reabsorbed by the tissues. Okay? But in the reproductive tract of the woman, that sperm gets to live up to 5 days precisely because of the nutrition that is provided by the cervical mucus. And the other quality of the cervical mucus, particularly during fertility, is that it also serves as a lubricant, you see? So it has those, at least those 3 qualities: nutrition, highway, and nutrient, and lubricant. Now consider this. During the fertile time, because of the change in pH, and maybe some other chemical activity that is going on. Those same fibers, long polymers, start twisting up, twisting and rolling up upon themselves, so that what used to be long fibers now is a mesh, a wad, similar to fishing line when it gets tangled, all right? That kind of a mesh. And that's why what used to be a highway for the sperm during the fertile time, during ovulation, is now a roadblock for that sperm. And the sperm cannot get through actually because of the plugs, okay? And so you see that that same mucus now is acting as a spermicide of sorts by a roadblock for not allowing the sperm, who are also microscopic, to go through. And that is by far the best natural way of avoiding conception. You see? Also because of the fact that if the sperm were to get through that plug, that mesh, there's no egg to fertilize because ovulation has already occurred and it's over. And that egg has already been discarded, see? So that's the beauty of NFP, especially these first 3 primary symptoms that are associated directly with the ovulation process. Okay, now, it turns out that, okay, so for the sake of completion, let me stop for a moment. I don't know if there are any particular questions. There's much more detail, of course. You can get online and look this up. There's a lot of information there on natural family planning that you can look up. But I do want to mention briefly the other 7 symptoms. Middle Schmerz, again, it's German for middle pain. Schmerz is pain in German. All right. Schmerz is pain, and Mittel is middle. So, excuse me, abdominal pain is caused by the movement of the infundibulum toward the ovary. You know that I keep mentioning that there's a little gap here between the fallopian tube and the ovary, that they're not totally fully attached, so a little gap there, okay? So when ovulation is about to occur, the follicle is about to rupture, what happens is that because of hormonal signaling, this glove part of the tube, which again is called the infundibulum, will move close, or literally move close in to catch the egg, all right? That little movement, which can only be a few millimeters, is gonna cause some pain to the woman in her belly, okay? In the abdominal region. Sometimes the pain will be on one side, sometimes on the other, sometimes it's more generalized and the woman can't really tell which ovary is ovulating, the left or the right, but that's why I say there's a range. And it depends on each woman, it depends on the age, and depends on many factors, okay? But it's there. And it's a fairly broad range of symptom. That's the middle Schmerz, which is very different from the cramps of menstruation, because it's like 2 weeks apart, all right? It's at the opposite end. This is precisely during ovulation, where the cramps of menstruation is 2 weeks later, way after ovulation. All right, spotting can also happen a little bit because of the rupturing of the follicle. Can cause a little bit of capillary loss, and that little bit of blood can also go down the tube and come out with the mucus and do a little bit of spotting of blood. But it's not obviously something very strong as what happens with menstruation itself. Well, the whole lining, the inner lining of the uterus is discarded. The endometrium, it says, is sloughed off. It comes out, so there's much more blood in the menstruation itself. Little spotting can occur. Again, big range of variation from woman to woman. The swollen vagina and vulva, which are the opening to the vagina itself, the vulva, the lips, the labia, all right? Because the woman is retaining water, is retaining fluid. And that again is a hormonal effect. It causes a woman to retain some fluid, and some of that fluid accumulates specifically in this region of the reproductive tract, which is going to be associated with the eventual intercourse. So that's part of a physiological reaction that can happen, again, with great variation from person to person. The libido, as you know, is a psychological term for desire, sexual desire, okay? So obviously with an increased estrogen, there's an increased libido, just like with an increased testosterone, there's also an increased libido in the man. The only difference is that whereas the woman is cycling so that her estrogen will increase during ovulation, for men, we don't cycle, not in this sense. So our testicles are producing testosterone in principle all the time. So that increase in testosterone is normally always there, okay? And so that's where we have a difference in the libido of the woman versus the man with regards to the cycle desire for the woman and the constant desire for the man on average in general for normal people. All right, moving forward. And again, you can see that all this is geared toward the act of intercourse for the possibility of fertilization. So it has a natural thing. Thanks be to God, on top of the hormones is the human will, so that we can control a libido, you know, and we should control a libido according to the ethics of the human will. So the fact that the libido is there doesn't mean that we have to engage, but rather the will tell us what's ethical and what's not ethical. Breast tenderness also will happen. Again, it's a hormonal side effect, especially around the nipple area, that the woman, it just becomes more tender when she's ovulating. General bloating, I mentioned already, she's retaining more water during that time, so don't weigh yourself when you're ovulating because it's going to look a little higher than the normal weight. It's just water retention, okay? And finally, ferning. So ferning is interesting. How many of you had ever heard about ferning? Have you? A little bit? No? Okay, so ferning is interesting because ferning comes from fern, which is a plant, right? It's a non-vascular plant. And this is what happens with ferning. I mentioned that there's a higher, it's mostly estrogen that is going to be impacted. So the estrogen produced in the ovaries is going to impact directly the pituitary gland, which is a master gland that controls other parts of the body and so on and so forth. But there will be higher amount of estrogen in general in her whole body. And it's going to be affecting other glands, including the salivary glands. So there will be more estrogen in the salivary glands, which have nothing to do with reproduction, right? And so in the saliva, there will be more estrogen during ovulation. A little bit, but more. And therefore, there is a technique whereby the woman can take a little bit of her saliva and put it on a slide. A slide is a glass. I'm talking about a microscopic slide, right? Which is just a little flat, transparent glass, rectangular glass. A drop of saliva. Let it dry out at room temperature. Okay, let it dry out naturally at room temperature, will be slowly. And what happens is when that saliva dries out slowly, naturally, if there is estrogen in it to a certain level, the estrogen will actually crystallize. And the crystal will form a crystalline pattern, which under a little microscope looks like a fern, has a ferning pattern, because that is the ferning pattern. And I'm going to show you an actual fern here for reference. The actual, no, the fern, just the plant. En español, helecho. Okay. not el hecho, but el hecho, single word. All right, so you see, that's a fern, all right, el hecho, and it looks like that pattern a little bit. You see? It's a ferning pattern, but it's actually estrogen crystallization in the saliva because of the higher content. Not that accurate, it's the least of the accurate, the least of the symptoms, okay? But you can buy this kit that is a ferning kit that comes with a little tube that is the microscope. Oh, kit. Here it is. Okay. For $40. Probably inside the little box is the, what you might call it, microscope slides, something like that. And then this is the actual scope, the little scope, all right? It's like a little tiny telescope, it's a microscope, that will allow the person to see the ferning pattern or not. So you have all these kits available. There's a symptothermal, there's a thermometer. That only has decimal point. Anyway, you can buy these kits that will show, yeah. You show the pattern like that. And infertile, there's no estrogen to be detected, okay? This is another one, little tube. So that's also available, but you know, it's not too accurate, so it's not to be trusted too much, but I include it for the sake of completion because these are the 7 secondary symptoms, all right? When these symptoms match the 3 primary, then it's a confirmation. But if there's a contradiction between the primary and the secondary symptoms, one should always follow the primary symptoms because they are more directly associated with the ovulation event itself. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about the timing because the timing is very important. I mentioned that the ovulation event is on average 24 hours, right? So normal ovulation, the egg will be at the ampulla for 24 hours on average. After that, it becomes over-ripened and has to be discarded because it's too late. So this narrow window of fertilization is how long? 24 hours. That's the narrow window, okay? Keeping in mind that the cycle on average is 28 days, all right? It's a lunar cycle, a month for keeping it simple, keeping the math simple. However, the sperm lives inside the female tract for up to 5 days. So really, the expanded window of fertilization is 5 days because, in other words, they could have had intercourse up to 5 days before ovulation, and she could still get pregnant, okay? So that's why we have to look at that expanded window of 5 days. Then, to make it easy and convenient on a weekly basis, let's say we add 1 day before the 5, just as precaution, and we add another day after as precaution. We end up with 7 days, which happens to be 1 week out of the month, out of the 4 weeks. Follow? So it's 25%. So we can say that on average, at most, a woman is only fertile 25% of the time within each month, within each cycle, 25%. The converse of that is that she's infertile 75% of the days within each month, okay? So now let's apply that to a couple who is either seeking children or seeking to avoid children. For the couple who is seeking to have children, again, in principle, they would concentrate their intimacy during the week of fertility, during the time that she's ovulating, right? That's for a couple who's actually seeking to have a child. For the couple who is seeking to avoid children, then they would have their intimacy the other 3 weeks and abstain for 1 week during the ovulation time. And that's the theory behind NFP. It depends on what the couple wants, what the couple is looking for. It's looking for having a child or it's looking to avoid children. So you see, looking to have a child, they would concentrate their intimacy during the week of fertility. For avoiding children, they would have their intimacy during the other 3 weeks and abstain during that 1 week. All right? That's when everything goes well. And she has become familiar enough with her symptoms that she has the confidence to tell, yes, look, honey, I'm ovulating today, tomorrow, the day after, on this day in the calendar. Because in the past several months and several years, that's what it's been. Okay, and all the symptoms are pointing that way. All right, now, we consider the man and the husband. What is on the side of the husband? Because he's not cycling, okay? And therefore, for him, all of this NFP up until now is theory, is theory. But what's the practice for him? The practice for him basically is the discipline that it takes to either abstain if they're seeking to have, to avoid children, or to concentrate their activity when they're seeking, when she's ovulating. Okay, so basically the discipline plus, it's a whole cluster of things, if you will, the respect, the communication, the dialogue, the generosity between the couple so that the decision is a mutual decision. And it's really, the decision is by the two of them, which ultimately will lead them to this kind of sacrificial love, you know, which is the more mature, responsible love to have for the couple. And therefore, also opening their hearts to the presence of God in their marriage, in their daily activity. And that allows God ultimately to decide when, you know, to have the children or not, because then they are, it is in this sense that the couple is really collaborating with God's will, with God's desire. And that's when the couple becomes co-creator with God in creating, literally creating this new life. All right. The couple provides the biological material. The Lord provides the soul, unique human soul. And between the combination of those two, we have a human being, a new human being that has never existed before, will never exist again. And according to God's plan, will exist for all eternity as that individual, that new individual. So there's a lot of richness in the theology of marriage, okay? When the couple is patient enough to take a look and to examine this. And in fact, even before they become a couple, for young men and for young women to become aware of this, it's a richness that they can bring to the marriage, especially if the other person is receptive to it and is willing to listen, because sometimes one is on board and the other one is not on board, and what to do in those cases. Very challenging, very challenging. That's why the engagement time and the time of noviazgo is very important to really get to know the value system of the other person, because the other person may not be on the same page, regardless of what he or she says, you know, because we can talk the moon. We can talk the moon, but then you got to walk the talk. That's where really that engagement time, that time of getting to know each other slowly, without rushing things, is very, very important. Much easier to get out of the relationship that has not gone too far than to get out of it after they've done too much together and now they're kind of committed. Well, we've gone this far, now we just got to get married, right? Okay, so a lot to think about here. I want to take it back to the whole argument of the principle of bioethics as a means and as an end, because we're looking at NFP as the healthier alternative, either to contraceptive for avoiding children or to IVF for wanting to have children. Okay? So we have to justify it at both levels, from the principal perspective, as a mean and as an end. So, as an end, as a means, there's no separation between the unitive and the procreative dimension, right? The couple is only availing themselves of a natural process. Okay, there's nothing artificial that is interfering between these two dimensions. Nothing artificial done in the lab or done either mechanically or chemically or surgically to interfere with the whole process. And therefore, it's respectful of human nature. It's just a natural cycle that the couple is availing themselves. It allows for that intimacy to be both a physical and a spiritual intimacy, especially because of the dialogue, the communication, and the generosity that goes on between the couple, so that it's not just a bodily thing that's occurring, all right? It's also an intimacy of the souls, of the spirit, of the conscience of these two people. As an end, I refer to Humanae Vitae, if there are well-grounded reasons. This is in the case that it's being used to avoid children. Why is NFP not really contraception? It's not artificial contraception, not just because of the fact that nothing artificial is being used. Because remember, I define contraception as the intention to avoid children without a serious reason, okay? So it's at the level of the will. Why is it a couple who is avoiding children through NFP, why are they not really contracepting? You know, isn't it, in the end, isn't it the same? They're avoiding children, you know, so why isn't it contraceptive? Because it's not a contraceptive mentality. When you think about it, NFP is not using anything artificial, right? So just they're availing themselves of the natural cycle of the woman. And they're having their intimacy only exclusively during her infertile time. First of all, there has to be a serious reason, a well-grounded reason, so they have been able to justify avoiding the children. And that is ethical. It's in Humanae Vitae. It's in the document. All right. So for serious reasons, a couple may avoid children. So that's justified. Let's say it could be finances, which is a typical reason, or it could be any others that are listed there. They're moving, there's a health issue, et cetera, et cetera. But they're availing themselves of the natural cycle, which means that since they're not using anything artificial, let's say that there was an error in the calculation, or for some reason, in that particular month, she was not regular. In other words, the symptoms were off, and she actually becomes pregnant. This couple that is using NFP to avoid children would have to be willing to accept that pregnancy and not abort, not kill the child, because now pregnancy has occurred already. In other words, fertilization has occurred. And that's the proof. That's the bottom line proof that NFP is not being used as a contraceptive. In other words, there's a reasonable control of avoiding children, but there's not the absolute control that Sanger was seeking with the pill. You follow? In the contraceptive mentality, what is desired is an absolute control over fertilization. In fact, and that's why it's so damaging, because no matter how hard we try, we cannot have an absolute control over fertilization because there is breakthrough ovulation. Even with all the artificiality that you want to throw at it. You can throw the mechanical with a condom. And so the man is using a condom, the woman is using the pill, and on top of that, they both have had tubal ligation and vasectomy. And still is not going to be 100%. There could still be a possible pregnancy coming out of that scenario, because nature is what it is, okay? And nature will try to do its darnest to stay on track with what it's supposed to do. Therefore, much as we would desire, we cannot have absolute control. So the couple that does NFP instead, all right, is using reasonable control, all right, but still following nature's guideline. And so if fertilization does happen, that couple using NFP is willing to accept that pregnancy and not kill the child, all right? And that's the mentality. So really, at the end of the day, it's not a contraceptive mentality, but it's a pro-life mentality. However, for serious reasons, they have been able to justify it at this particular time in their marriage to not have children. It's a decision that needs to be reviewed periodically also. It cannot be indefinitely. Even though the document talks about, even if it's kept, the decision is kept indefinitely in the marriage, all right? But that decision should be reviewed periodically to see if the serious conditions still exist or no longer, right? So there's kind of a default position in favor of life. So that we see that human sexual intercourse, in order for it to be truly and fully human, it should be love-giving and life-giving, okay? That should be the desire for the couple. All right, so basically, we're coming to the end here. As an end, what we want to be avoided, of course, is that contraceptive mentality that the children are to be avoided, absolutely, you know, and that they essentially become like an evil to be avoided, all right? No, they're not an evil. They're the natural process, and thank God that our parents were pro-life because we're here today. Mm-hmm. So there's this openness, a fundamental openness toward life. And in that sense is that the couple is truly and fully cooperating with God in creating this new life. And so the couple becomes co-creators, which is amazing that we can actually become co-creators with God in a new, unique human life that will then exist for all eternity. Mm-hmm. So again, kind of the ideal, it's a work in progress. I'm very aware that most people never even think about this, all right? Especially when one is a teenager or a young adult. But better late than never, right? As we become informed, one of the purposes of this program is as we become informed and hopefully convinced of the value of this position of principled ethics, we would try to promote this among family, friends, other people that we know, all right, in a respectful way. But really, I encourage you to use the slides, to get into the conversation, even one-on-one with other family and friends, of the benefits of this. Of course, it's always going to be the higher road. Principled ethics, I'm not naive. I understand that the principle bioethics is the higher road. It's the more difficult one. It takes discipline, it takes the generosity, it takes the sacrificial love. In my opinion, it's the one that is most rewarding. It's the one that's most rewarding, all right? Okay, that's it for today. Again, giving you a lot here in relative short time. When you do your summaries, you can review this, ponder it a little bit, okay, put it in prayer. I think there's a lot of treasure and richness here. And also consider that the couples who are looking to practice NFP, they're not alone. Many couples over the years and the decades are practicing NFP now. They're even practicing NFP for health reasons, for no religious reason necessarily. I'm looking for the list. Yes. Some couples, they're into health, all right? And she doesn't want to take any hormones. He doesn't want to be using any mechanical stuff. You know, they just want to have their natural intercourse. And so for health reasons, they're looking at NFP. Mm-hmm. And many couples do that because it's a healthy way. Anecdotally, I haven't found the actual documentation, but I keep hearing anecdotally that, so the rate of divorce today is around 50 to 60%, excuse me, 60%, I'm talking about the American population. I mean, how many marriages do we know that have made it, you know, until one of the two dies? So that's the national average of divorce rate, pretty high. About half of marriages don't make it in the United States to the end. For the subgroup of couples who are using NFP, for whatever reason, either religious or health reasons, all right? The divorce rate is practically non-existent. It's less than maybe 5% or 2%, because there's so much communication between the couple. There's so much respect and bonding. They're in sync that they really give their intimacy priority, okay? And so the divorce rate is very, very little because they have such good communication. They're always thinking of the well-being of the other instead of themselves. But because it's mutual, it works out for the best of both. So something to consider. It's out there. It doesn't necessarily need to be religious, because at the end of the day, our religion at least follows a healthy anthropology, what is really best for the human. So, all right, that's all I have to offer really. Unless someone has a question or comments.
No questions here.
Yeah, sure, go ahead, Jorge.
No questions.
Mm-hmm.
No
no questions, okay. Okay. All right, then thanks again for listening to all this. I'm going to close it here, and we'll meet again next Saturday. Okay, make sure that you do the summaries in your own words, all right? Perhaps paraphrasing what I have. Sometimes I have a lot of verbosity, if you will, in the PowerPoint, but it's not a question of just copy and paste from the PowerPoint. Chew it up a little bit and give it back to me in your own words, okay? Okay.
How many lectures do we have for beginning of life?
Yes, so we have a total of 7, and this is the 5th already, so we have 2 more. We have 2 more lectures coming up, 2 more Saturdays.
Okay.
And then, like I mentioned, that next Saturday after that, which is March 6th, there is no lecture, and there is a possibility of coming to the forest that Saturday morning before we start on the end of life, okay? So March 6th.
Okay.
Thanks again, all the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
You too now.